Gloria Abramoff, it is an absolute joy and a pleasure to have you with us today, to have the conversation about leadership, faith inspiration, the world around us, and the work you do and the legacy that you have built steadily, quietly, and with plenty of effort. We want to hear a little bit about your story. Lead Integrity aims to showcase wisdom acquired through learning and serving communities, issues, dreams, and aspirations. You've built your own legacy over many, many years, and it hasn't been easy, and yet you've achieved so much. We want to hear a bit about this work. Share a little bit, Gloria, about how you would identify yourself to this wide world. So instead of me reading out your bio, you share who's Gloria, and tell us a bit about your work and where you're at now. And then we will talk together about how you got here and what you think of this world around us right now. Gloria, how would you like to describe yourself?
Well, first of all, before I describe myself, I think people watching this or listening to this need to understand the mutual respect we have for each other, but the deep respect that I have for you, and that sadly, there aren't many people that I come across that are true leaders with a heart and a spirit that we can learn from and really feel their impact. And so, which is, I think, a tragedy of our times. Um, and so, for me to have met you as and to have taken your spirit, your wisdom, your keen sense of justice, and to have built a relationship with you is a privilege on my part. So I just feel I want to say that. Um, Thank you for asking me. It's very difficult for me to try and encapsulate my life because last year I was 70 and I keep going and in a way, I just think I've come a bit full circle because, I come from an immigrant family. We live in North London. My parents had an arranged marriage. My father was from Uzbekistan. Was born in Tashkent. And my mother, his second cousin, was born in Jerusalem in the mid-20s, and their marriage was arranged by my maternal and paternal grandparents, and my mother, after the War of Independence in 48, was flown over here to marry my father. And the last time she saw him, she was 2 and he was 15. um, and I started off with that story because, it's a romantic story, but also because it's a story of immigrants trying to make a life for themselves in a foreign country. And my mother, having fought in the army against the British mandate, comes here into the grey and cold of London, leaving the oranges and the celebration of the War of Independence that she had fought for. So, so for them it was a battle, but um, they were desperate to fit in, um, but retain their culture. And I think that has been part of my raison d'etre, to fit in, but to maintain my culture. Um, and I think it's been quite difficult at times to fit in because um, I am quite different. And because I chose a public service path rather than a commercial path, um, fitting in wasn't always easy for me. It was always quite a challenge. Um, I didn't do well at school. I remember um, aiming to be at the bottom of the year rather than the top of the year because I would never make it to the top of the year. And I just felt, well, you're not going to be memorable if you're in the middle of the year. So I never did any work and I was always at the bottom of the year and everybody still remembers me for that. Um, I I didn't I from a very early age, both at synagogue where I was taken to and at school, And also everything around me, I had a real sense that of justice or injustice, and that is what has really been the very core of me. I'm very intuitive. I can get the measure of people very quickly. And I know when I'm not being told the truth necessarily. I'm trying not to swear. I'm a natural swearer, so I'm trying very hard not to swear. Um, so, so there were very few expectations of me as a child. Nobody expected anything of me. I was one of three girls, but from a very large family. So I have a thousand cousins, if not more. And I can virtually travel to any part of the world and there'll be family there. Now, that actually gives you unbelievable confidence. And I'm telling you about my family because it's my family, and knowing that my family would do anything for me and love me without question to the point of, of virtually strangling me with their love, that actually gives you confidence and you become fearless. And I would argue that I am fearless. So there was no expectations of me at school. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I knew I was going to work with people, and I knew that I would be an advocate and a campaigner. And I am a natural campaigner and a natural advocate. And so when I left school with no expectations, but hopefully to marry a Jewish accountant or lawyer, um, as was expected of me, I went to work in a day centre for old people, and I was the lowest of the low. This is my great sense of achievement. I was always at the bottom of everything. So I was the lowest of the low, and I was what we call a care assistant, and I would look after old people, and I'd, wash them and dress them and entertain them, and I realized I was really good at this, that I'm actually a natural cheerleader. And I was spotted by the director of social services, and this was in the mid 70s. And she said to me, look, unless you go and study something, you're never going to get on, and you have the potential. So she arranged for me, I think it was in my early 20s, even though I loved my job, she arranged for me to go back to college and do a diploma in social work. And she was going to keep my job open for me. And so I went to college to do my diploma in social work. And in my second year, I had to specialize and I chose community work. And I had to find an internship. And I remember watching a BBC programme on a Sunday night called Grapevine, and the credits said produced by the Community Programmes Unit. And I thought, oh, there's a Community Programmes Unit. And this is like in 1978. And I wrote to them, and fast track, I get a 1 year's work experience working on community programs for the BBC. Now, I didn't media wasn't part of my world. It was never part of my ambition. It wasn't part of my thinking. I was a grassroots campaigner, but I was working in a community programs unit. And this is what, 40 years ago, 43 years ago. And um, and you could be very experimental. And I realized that I was a really good researcher because, what I'm going to do is bring you up to date. And my big issue is a lack of curiosity. This is my big thing at the moment, people's lack of curiosity. And I've always been really curious. It doesn't matter what level anybody's at, whether it's the gardener, the postman, the managing director, the director general. I'm curious. I'm a storyteller. I'm interested in people's stories, which is probably why I did well as a social worker. Anyway, I got to the BBC. I was a researcher, and I stayed there for the next 30 years. And so that was that. And so that's how my career took off. And I never went back to social work. However,
Mhm.
because I was really concerned that I would end up being in a glass box, that I would end up being disengaged from the world, because somewhere like the BBC, in those days, you were quite infantilized. Everything was done for you. And
Mm.
the more senior you got, the less engaged you got
Oh.
with, the kind of programs you were making. So you weren't running around with a tape recorder. You were managing, doing HR, doing development, doing budgets. So you weren't really connected to content. And so I was always concerned that I would disconnect with community. So for my first 10 years at the BBC, I managed to organize that I took 2 or 3 months off in the summer and
Mhm.
I went to work as a play leader or a daycare assistant or so I always kept very grounded and connected, and that's always been really important to me. So however senior I got, and I did achieve very senior roles in the BBC, I always felt connected at a very grassroots level. So my career at the BBC very early on, because of the family that I came from, where at my home we would have Afghanis and Pakistanis and Indians and Nigerians and Chinese, and our house was just full of food and drink and parties and laughter and diversity because of the work that my father was doing, that this all seemed really normal to me. So when I went to the BBC in the early 80s, which was very white and very traditional and very sort of civil service like, I couldn't relate to half these people. I didn't understand, and I didn't understand, genuinely didn't understand why the BBC looked like this. And so, without any diversity or DEI initiative or special money, I would be looking around for great communicators from who are non-white to bring them in, because I was at that point editor of a radio station, and my job was about bringing in new talent, which was very natural to me. So, so I ran a department that was just full of different cultures, ages, sexualities, in the 80s. And I remember launching and the first BBC's first gay program and Irish program and Jewish program and black program. And I remember with my scripts for gay programs, for example, they had to go all the way up to the director general, and I was running a little radio station. Um, so there was a real sort of sensitivity around the content. So just to conclude my career at the BBC, so I did a lot of talent development, and made programs, but then I realized that I wanted to have a lot more influence. And so I applied for a job as editor special projects for a department of the BBC called Nations and Regions that was responsible for 40 local radio stations around the country and Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, content that was coming out of that. And I got the job. And I remember my boss at the time, who I didn't get on very well with, um, my leaving do, he said that I was leaving to become head of wheelchairs. Um, and and I remember thinking at the time, okay, I'm going to show you how we can interpret wheelchairs into really interesting and engaging content. And in a way, he set a challenge for me. And so I led a big department where we did huge social action campaigns, and I would select content ideas, whether it be sort of sex, family, finance, food, health, and I would help local radio stations and online services and TV stations to um, to bespoke the content according to their audience. And so I was very much a cheerleader. And in some places around the BBC, like, I don't know, in Cumbria or Cornwall, they hadn't really met somebody like me, a gobby Jewish woman from Northwest London. And so that was sort of always quite interesting because there was often an education campaign preceded me and succeeded me about me and who I was. And so I was never automatically embraced, which actually suited me. I sort of quite like being an outsider. Um, Except when I was on senior boards at the BBC, I was very much the court jester, uh, which they. the BBC those days needed some people like me, but not too many. Uh, and so I did that, and then I led the BBC's Africa campaign. In 2005, Tony Blair set up the Africa Commission here in the UK, and I was very involved in how we interpreted content about Africa and all different countries and all different challenges on the BBC. And I remember going, and it was the first time that I filmed in Ethiopia, and I made documentaries in Ethiopia about the AIDS and epidemic there. Um, and then around about sort of 2005, I was working as a runner on the Live Aid campaign, and I was looking after a Live Aid concert in Hyde Park, and I was looking after Paul McCartney and George Michael, as just as a runner, looking after them. And it was my job to get them on stage. Paul McCartney was opening Live Aid, and George Michael and Paul McCartney were closing Live Aid.
Hold on, hold on. Just for those who may not know this world, what's a runner? When you say,
Oh, when you are like when you look after the musician and make sure they have tea, coffee, their fruit, their bowls of fruit.
with all that seniority and all that
Yeah,
experience, you
yeah,
are a runner for these
yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because I just felt I've always felt that it's not about the position, it's not about your status, it's
Mhm.
about the experience. And I'm not at all status driven
Mhm.
um, until I left the BBC, and then I realized how important status was.
Oh, we'll get back to that in a second. Go ahead, please.
So it was in 2005, and it was the second big Live Aid concert in Hyde Park, with the world's musicians there. Everybody was there. Kofi Annan even arrived. He was then was it UN General Secretary? It was overwhelming in the kind of people that were there. But I was asked to look after Paul McCartney and George Michael. Anyway, we're finishing the concert, and the end of the concert, I don't know if you remember, but at the end of the concert, everybody that performed got up on stage. The Who, Pink Floyd, Annie Lennox, anybody that was everybody got up on the stage. And I decided to go at the back of the stage
Mhm.
and sing Hey Jude with everybody else. So if you go on YouTube, you'll see me right at the back. And it was at that point, and the reason why I'm telling you this is because it was at that point that I thought, yeah, I think I want to leave the BBC now and I want to
Really?
do something else.
Ah,
I'd been there, I think I'd been there about 35 years and had the most amazing experiences and done, some amazing work, changing people's attitudes, organizing beyond the broadcast materials to support audiences to make changes. And there I was on the stage singing Hey Jude, looking out onto Hyde Park and just thinking, actually, I don't know if it can get any better than this. This is such a laugh, and I need to leave. But I knew that if I left the BBC at that point
mhm.
and went out into the big wide world, that my last few jobs, the position wouldn't really make any sense to anybody because they're internal positions that people don't really understand. And one of my biggest frustrations at the BBC was how charity was interpreted. And the BBC's charity was Children in Need. So they raise money through an annual telethon, and something like 40 million pounds each year is distributed to various children's charities. And I always felt unbelievably frustrated with Children Need and the telethon because it was still about poor children and it wasn't about empowerment and it wasn't about proper storytelling. So I asked if I could go to Children Need as their first creative director and managing director. And it was also quite strategic on my part because I knew that if I had that experience, that when I left the BBC, not knowing what I was going to do, at least I could say, I'd been MD of Children in Need, and people knew what that was. And so I went to Children in Need and I completely revamped it, brought in a whole new editorial team and creative team. And then in 2007, I left the BBC with no idea what I was going to do. And I was 52 at the time. And I just felt that I needed to go because I was becoming the arse that I was worried that I would become in terms of, I was now not really connected. I'd been at a senior level for quite some time. Everything was sort of done for me. Not now, the BBC is completely different, but it was so status driven then. So I left and I just worked for charities and I worked for Kids Company. I worked for the Prince's Trust. I worked for all different charities, advising them. I think people like to have me by their side, and I realise that that's a role that I play quite well.
Mm.
Um, so I worked for charities, but then I set up my own company with Tim Samuels called Tonic Productions, and but we wanted an immediate team, and so we negotiated with Jamie Oliver with
Mm.
his production company that we should be part of their production company and help them focus more on their, the campaigning element, but also on their audio side. So we did a deal with Jamie, and I ended up sitting on his board as a trustee. Um, and then I don't know, I always feel that the angels and the fairies are floating around me, and good things happen and some things happen, and um the company did really well, and we set up, groundbreaking programs like Men's Hour and, health programs. And during that time I also helped like the Eden Project, which is a big project in the UK, a big sort of environmental project, set up a national campaign called the Big Lunch, where people each year have street parties outside, and we developed that to show the necessity of big lunches and how if you bring communities together great things can happen. And so I got very involved in big campaigns and help, I worked with CNA on their Inspiring Women campaign. So I'm sort of quite good at messaging and engaging audiences.
Mm.
And then, and we're almost up to date. And then about 7 years ago, I met a woman called Jani Guest who asked me to help her make little films for children in schools about careers, because she felt quite rightly so that so much opportunity is dependent on your network, and if you don't have those networks it can be really quite challenging. So if you're a kid in North England and your family, generations of your family haven't worked, and you're interested in ophthalmology,
Mm.
how would you even get there?
Mm.
And so we made these little films called Loud, Live Out Your Dreams, about all these different careers, but in a really sort of animated, TikToky, YouTubey kind of way, which is lovely. And we got money from the government, and they went into every school, primary school. And then she was setting up her own company, um, and she asked me if I would be managing director of her factual division. And I was 67 then. And I thought, God, at 67, to be offered a job where you get paid really well and you get healthcare. and and I just thought, yeah, why don't I do that? And that's where I'm at. So and then I'll finish, my last so we set up the company nearly 4 years ago. I pitched and won to make the legacy documentaries on Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, which was unbelievable. It was just see, it was a gift that was sent to me to do that and to really learn about Jonathan Sacks, who we all know is this great um, philosopher and thinker of our time, who we still miss. Um, and then we won the pitch to do Barbara Streisand's legacy film.
Mm.
Then, through the most serendipitous experiences, we ended up making the Commandant Shadow, which we sold to Warner and went on global release, which was the story of Rudolf Hoss, the commandant of Auschwitz. And we got his son and his grandson and a survivor of the orchestra that was playing at Auschwitz and her daughter to meet. And for the son and the grandson to face their father and their grandfather's atrocities for the first time. And so it's a film of understanding each other, reconciliation, but also examines trauma and intergenerational trauma. And I would say it's it's my film that will happily end my full-time career. I'm really proud of that film. I think it really encapsulates everything about me, in terms of how it was run. I put together an all-female production team, which was really important because I knew that we would be researching some of the most traumatic material, and that we would have to deal with our contributors who were seriously traumatized and affected, and we had a duty of care. And I felt that we really needed, as a team, we really needed support. We really needed to support each other.
Mm.
And that was, I think, a smart thing to do. Um, I wasn't necessarily involved in the editorial and the arc of the story. I was the producer that raised the money and put the whole thing together. We premiered in, America, Israel, Germany, Mumbai. Um, it's gone all over the world. It won the Yad Vashem Prize for the best Holocaust related film. And just to finish off, we were in the Times, the UK Times, and the Guardian. We were number 12 and number 14 of the top
Wow.
100 films of the year. So yeah, I look back with a lot of pride, amazing experiences. I think I've always been true to myself. I've got myself into a lot of trouble over the years, but it's never bothered me because I think the only thing that could frighten me is anything happening to my children. Anything else, I'm not really fussed about. I know that's amazing, but I don't worry about that. I've never suffered from imposter syndrome. I just think, we do the best we can and we get away with it. Some of us don't always get away with it, but and so I take quite a pragmatic view. I think that's probably got to do with the fact that I was born in London. My friendship, I still live here. I've got very solid friendships. I'm militant about my relationships. And so my relationships outside of work are as important, if not more important. And I think that grounds you. So that sort of encapsulates me.
Lovely. Absolutely amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Gloria. Um, I have given that legacy and what you can look back with and the sense of pride, right, justly that you have in what you've accomplished. Um, I like that you ended by saying it's the friendships that ground one and the relationships that ground one. And I think that that's actually pure wisdom for the times of polarization that we live in today. Um, one of the things that I hope you'll forgive me for asking, given the icing on top of the cake that you described, this last movie that you made that required a tremendous amount of um, care and nourishment, not only of the people you were filming and the theme, but also of the people who were part of your team in that space. You did all this at the time when there's been an uproar in that same region, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. How did any of this impact or affect you, or how do you see what's happening in the region now, given this remarkable legacy of your own self and family and work and the people that you've showcased over the years? How do you see what's going on in the region today?
Um, As you can imagine, it's really hard. And I do spend a lot of time crying because, you know, crying for everybody. Um, and and I just think it's such a waste. Um, but of course, I'm smart. I understand the geopolitics and I understand the history. Um, I'll tell you how I can answer that in several ways. I remember when Syria broke out and we saw mass exodus of refugees going towards Turkey and Lebanon and trying to get out of Syria, and the news footage was overwhelmingly distressing about what was going on. And, DEC, the Disaster Emergency Committee, were asking for money, and I couldn't see how my 10, 15, £20 was going to make any difference. And so at that point, I made a promise to myself that I can't have any impact in Syria, but I can have an impact on my local community. And so I made a promise to myself that I would be an even better local citizen. And I've stuck to that. And I think that's really important. So I care deeply about my street, my environment, my community. I organize the street party every year. I do this, I do that, I do that. So I think, because you can't, there are some things that you can have no influence or impact on. But so you look to where can I? So that was one thing. In terms of what's going on in the Middle East, um, I come from it from an emotional and an intellectual point of view. An emotional because my great grandparents were early Zionists. They started to build infrastructures in Israel in the mid 1800s. We have a family charitable trust in Israel, where we own synagogues, old people's homes, orphanages, even a domestic violence unit we built in the early 1900s. So I have a huge family connection there. Where where I can't go into the conflict that I feel about Gaza, Israel, and the Netanyahu government. As you can imagine, I have very strong views about how that's being, how Israel is being led at the moment. And earlier on, I talked to you about leadership and my frustration with leadership. But where I feel I can do something because this has caused me so much pain, and because on October the 8th, 2023, 13 of us in the media put together a WhatsApp group, Jewish professionals in the media, and we just to support each other because we knew it was just, we knew it was going to erupt and that anti-Semitism was going to be a big issue, and it is a big issue in this country. Um, but now there are 500 of us, and it's a very vocal group, and sometimes it's a bit overwhelming in the conversation. Now, what's come out of that group is that it's quite divided about how people feel about the BBC, for example, and the BBC's coverage. And I decided that even though I have contacts at quite a senior level at the BBC, that me going in there, challenging their coverage and saying, well, Jeremy Bowen said this and Lise Doucette said that, and blah, that is actually, that doesn't help because the BBC is not just BBC News, it's local radio, it's online, it's got so many different parts to it that actually, while one's doing something, another part is doing something else, and there can be a bit of a balance. And I don't think it's my role to challenge their editorial necessarily. Lots of people are doing that. I see my role as educating them. And even when I was at the BBC, the lack of curiosity that people have, I found astounding. And the lack of curiosity in terms of you as a Muslim woman, or you as a Hindu man, or there was, they, people didn't show enough interest in us as individuals and who we were, where we came from. It was very much about objectives, strategies, appraisals. But so my role for the last year has been not role, but what I've been doing is going in and seeing people, at a senior level and giving them reading lists
Mhm.
and giving them videos to watch and making myself available for them to ask me lots of questions. So, what's it like being a Jewish woman from an Israeli mother living here? Just to ask me, interrogate my thinking, off the record, find out a bit more about me, who I am, why I'm feeling like this. Meet some of my friends, meet people outside your media bubble and outside your Rolodex of contacts. And so that's what I've been doing. And I think it's been having quite an effect because so much of so much of what's going on, the pain is in your heart.
Mhm.
It's not just an intellectual response. It's painful. I'm wearing my Star of David, okay, which I never used to wear.
Mhm.
Not because I made a considered decision not to wear it. It just didn't dawn on me. I didn't even have a mezuzah at my door. But in the last 2 years, I've worn my Star of David. I put a mezuzah on my door. I go to synagogue a lot more. I want to feel. I need to be with my people. That's another response. I really need to be with my people. It was very difficult and I don't enter into any online spats. I don't do that, and I've never done that. Um, it was on a work basis. It was very difficult for us because we were in the middle of editing The Commandant's Shadow, and Warner had just bought the film.
Mhm.
And so we had to then think about how contemporary is this film going to be given
It's going.
what's just happened. And we realized that everything that we had, we'd filmed 90 hours of footage to cut it down to a 104-minute documentary. But everything that we had was as relevant now as it was when we recorded it. So when so when Anita Lasker-Wolfish, who was the now nearly 100-year-old cellist at Auschwitz, when she says, as Jews, we have nowhere that's safe. Even Israel isn't safe. And she recorded this 4 years ago. That's as relevant. I think the difficulty was when she said in the film, I don't know why Jews are hated. What have we done that we're hated? Now, the difficulty that we're suffering at the moment is the nuances in that phrase, because there is a difference between Jews and Israelis. There's a difference between Jews living in the diaspora than there are Jews living in Israel. There are, and so the nuances and the subtleties and the challenges of what subsequently happened after October the 7th still very live very deeply within me.
Mhm. That's very powerfully put. Thank you, Gloria. My last question on this, I promise, before we go into relatively safer areas of DEI, believe it or not. But I just
Yeah,
wonder whether do you feel, given everything you yourself feel at the moment, what you have seen, the legacy of the remarkable history that you've documented of your own people and the Zionist legacy and so on, do you feel that, would you be able to say, I can feel a bit more sympathy with Palestinian people today than I did before, or less sympathy today than I did before? How would you encapsulate your own feelings? I understand about the strength of reconnecting with one's own identity and one's people, as you said, my community. What about the other community that is so intimately connected and bound with yours in Israel, Palestine, and the rest of the world? How do you has anything changed in terms of your own sentiments about the other?
the way that my family grew up in Jerusalem was, amongst Arabs, Palestinians, Druze, Druid, Bedouins. Um, it wasn't, um, uh, it was a very sort of diverse multicultural experience for them, but it was just the norm. How can I not feel pain for the Palestinian people? Of course, how can I not feel pain given who I am and everything? Do I care? We have a school in Bethlehem. No, not in Bethlehem, in Beersheba, named after one of my cousins who died. And the whole ethos of the school is about bringing uh, Jews and Arabs together to understand each other better. That has always been at the very heart of all the work that my family have done. And it's at the very heart of who I am, just not in terms of Jews and Arabs, but in terms of people from all different cultures. So, what's happening is a tragedy beyond tragedy, but it's not a simple answer.
Understood. And it's you've answered it profoundly, and I appreciate that very much. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I think it's
No, I
important.
don't mind. I really don't mind. I'm really happy to debate openly, but I think it has to be debated with time and with context.
The issue isn't a debate. The issue really is to understand. It's the understanding
Absolutely, of
of
course I
it.
understand.
Yeah.
You
And
know, I've made programs in Bethlehem and Nazareth and Janine. I made a documentary. I've made three documentaries in the Middle East that were really important to me. One was about homosexuality in Israel, and that Israel at the time was the only army that would openly accept homosexuals and people with AIDS. Right at the time, I don't. This was 10 years ago, but we looked at homosexuality in Ramallah, and people coming from Ramallah to Tel Aviv to be able to be themselves, and that Tel Aviv was the gay capital of the world, and why. I made a documentary in northern Israel in a hospital where the IDF, this was about 5, 6 years ago, where the IDF were carrying people overtly across the border from Syria, carrying them over, putting them back together again physically in terms of limbs, arms, legs, and then taking them back to Syria. Right. Um, I've made so many different programs that can show how if you bring Jews, Arabs, Palestinians together, there's a lot of amazing work going on. That's why I was saying to you that I go into the BBC and suggest that they read something, they look at something, they talk to me, they talk to other people, because that's the only way that I, in my own little individual way, can affect change in any way. So I make content, or I look at what can I offer. I'm no great intellect. I am not an intellectual. I operate on a very emotional and instinct basis. Um, and so I look at what skills do I have rather than what skills I don't have but pretend I have. There's no point. And so I look at what can I offer? Who am I? What can I do? How can I affect change, or at least do something that teases better conversation?
brilliant. And that in and of itself is incredible and profound wisdom for everybody. Look at what you do have, what you can do with genuineness as opposed to the pretense of ability,
Yeah,
capability.
yeah.
And look at your own community, your local community, and speak to people. Be open about engaging others. I think there is already several nuggets of wisdom for what and how not only you have survived and thrived and built and continue to, but for others who are engaging in a public space and trying to figure out what to do with each other at a time when there's so much there is so much pretense, and it really is a world of pretense around us. So
It's a world of pretense. I think there was one play that I saw several years ago, and it was on the
Oslo Accords.
Oslo Accord. Thank you. Sorry, forgive me. The Oslo Accord. And they wrote somebody wrote a play on the background and how it led to it. And it was the Norwegian foreign minister, I think, that started the whole negotiations. And he brought the Palestinian delegation and the Israeli delegation to a hotel, and they were holed up in this hotel for about a month before they were even allowed to start negotiating. And they got to know each other, and they drank together, and they played chess together, and they talked about their families, and they discuss anything but Israel Palestine. So by the time they started to negotiate, they really they knew each other. They knew each other's spirit. They knew each other's challenges. They knew each other's pain. They knew what made each other laugh. There was a sense of connection. We go in to negotiate cold, not really understanding the other's culture, heritage, history, passion, fear, love. We go in hard on the table. And now with Trump and Putin, everybody negotiating like these men with in a sort of business way, it's no wonder we are where we are. It's incredible that we don't look at the other and try and understand the other to at least have some respect. There's so little respect for each other. I find that, it's painful. It's really painful for me.
And that's what you've dedicated your life to do, Gloria. You've dedicated
Totally,
your life to building
totally.
that respect on every level, in every community, between every different type of people. And frankly, that is also one of the main reasons I wanted to make sure that we could hear and learn from Gloria Abramoff's own experience, because you have not only exemplified and learned and practiced, but you have built a legacy of respect. Tiny part of it is how you and I can engage in a conversation and discussion, even though we actually occupy very different parts of the political spectra, but we share the same beating heart. And that's one thing you've done in your career. You have shown that beating heart in everyone, and you have given it value, worth, credibility, such that it is impossible to converse with you as someone on a totally different space, but it is impossible not to love you as one converses with you.
Oh,
And I think
sweetheart.
that's an incredible legacy that prophets of since time immemorial have brought humanity. And there's much to learn from what you've done and what you continue to do. And I just want to say tremendous appreciation and thanks for sharing, for caring, and for being willing to have this conversation on, let's say, not the easiest things around the world, and not at the easiest times either, but precisely because of all of this. So sincere thanks from my heart to a big heart like yours. I pray you continue to teach and to inspire and to show that love in action, in practical ways, in the most wondrous ways that you and the people like you can provide. We need your wisdom, your eye, your heart. We need it as humanity now more than ever. Our planet needs it more than ever. And so for this, I just want to say a very, very heartfelt thank you, Gloria Abramoff, for making this opportunity possible to learn from you, to hear you. um, Thank you for the respect that you have enacted, that you realize, and that you make possible. And with that, we come to the end of the interview, and I will stop the recording with your permission.